Hi class, welcome to, this is going to be chapter 9 and it deals with cellular respiration and fermentation. These are both energy producing cellular processes. They occur in relationship to the mitochondria. So let's begin. Our key concept questions, things that you'll want to think about is, what is cellular respiration? What are the two main types of fermentation? And then we're going to be comparing photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So the energy needs of life, we have to think about why do we need energy to live? So we are consumers, us as animals are consumers, and we need energy for synthesis to make things. We need energy for reproduction. To produce the actual reproductive cells takes energy. Active transport within our cells, all of those processes require energy. Movement, like that cheetah running, requires a great deal of energy. Temperature control, you can see in the top right hand picture a man ice fishing. That requires energy to maintain a stable body temperature. So we need energy for lots of things in life. Where do we get our energy from? That's the question. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that you eat it. But how does your body get the energy out of that food? That is what we're going to discuss in this set of notes. Energy is stored in organic molecules, in the actual chemical bonds of those molecules. And so things like carbohydrates, fats, proteins, we can get energy out of those molecules. Animals will eat these organic molecules. Remember, things that have to eat others are called heterotrophs. And then a calorie is how we measure the amount of energy in food, and it's specifically, the definition is the amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water 1 Celsius degree. So when you're looking at a nutrition label and they have calories listed, they have a process where they can burn the food that you're they've done this in a lab. They've burned the food and they've measured how much energy it takes to change the temperature of water, and that's how they figure out how many calories food has in it. For digesting, we need energy to digest food, but then we also extract energy out of it, and our intestines and our stomach has enzymes to help break down the food that we eat, because steak is going to be way too big for our cells to use. So your body has to break it down into the amino acids that steak is made out of. And that way your body can actually use those things because they're small enough. So your body has to take the large polysaccharides and the large compounds, these organic compounds, and break them down so that your body can actually use them. Here's a question to think about, just based on that information so far. In heterotrophs, energy for the life processes comes from the chemical energy stored in the bonds of, so what kind of molecules did I say you're going to see the energy stored in? Is it water molecules, oxygen molecules, organic compounds, or inorganic compounds? So the answer is number 3, organic compounds, the carbohydrates, the fats, the proteins. You might even want to write that next to organic compounds so that you remember those are the things that have energy. What is energy in biology? ATP. ATP is the source of energy for all of our cellular activities. Harvesting energy in stored food is a different story. We know that we have to eat to get energy, but how do we get it out of there? It's a process called cellular respiration. Remember how in the last set of notes I told you that breathing is different from respiration. And here is where we're going to talk about the exchange of gases inside of your cells. Breathing is an external process. Breathing takes air into your lungs and it pushes air out of your lungs. But your cells And the entire part of your body have to have the oxygen that's in the air from your lungs. So that oxygen has to diffuse into your bloodstream, has to make its way all to your cells, and then the oxygen can be used by your mitochondria in your cells. And what happens is the food that you've digested is also small enough to diffuse into your cells, into the mitochondria, and then the mitochondria can break down that food using the oxygen to get energy out of it. So again, this is a couple of formulas at the bottom that you will need to know. So put a big star next to both of them, and you can write know these, K-N-O-W, know these. So glucose and oxygen are needed for cellular respiration, and it's going to produce, remember the arrow means to produce, and it will make carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So in the chemical formula aspect, you should know this one as well. C6H12O6, that is glucose, plus 6 molecules of oxygen will produce 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 molecules of water plus ATP, and you're going to have heat energy produced as well. When I ask you for this formula, you can stop at the point where it says ATP. But just so you know, heat energy is a very important part of this process. And if you think about it, when your muscles shiver, when you're cold, they shiver because they're generating heat, and this is the process where that heat is going to come from. So it might be something you could add down there, you know, shivering muscles, that might click for you to help you remember. All right, what do we need to make this energy? We need our furnace. So that's our mitochondria. This is going to be our little powerhouse. When I ask you for the definition of the mitochondria, please do not write the furnace or the powerhouse. Those are just key words or clue words to help you remember what the mitochondria does. So if you know, okay, it's a powerhouse, it's the furnace. Oh, it's making energy. That's right. Okay. So a furnace, if you think of this as an analogy, a furnace needs fuel. Our furnace, our mitochondria, needs food. And specifically, we're going to talk about glucose as the food. And then it needs some helpers to get the most energy out of that food, and oxygen and enzymes are going to be the helpers. Because this process requires oxygen, this is called an aerobic process, or sometimes they call it aerobic respiration. Aerobic just means oxygen is present. The opposite of that is anaerobic, and we're going to talk about that as well. That's fermentation. We'll talk about it later. But these are the essential ingredients for this process. Okay, question. Most of the reactions of aerobic cellular respiration occur within the organelle known as the 1. Lysosome, 2. Nucleus, 3. Mitochondrion, 4. Vacuole. And hopefully you picked number 3 because that's what we've been talking about so far. Which substance is needed for aerobic cellular respiration to occur? So in this situation, you need to remember what aerobic is referring to because your choices are different gases. So is it oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, or methane? And the answer is oxygen. And if you think about if you've ever heard of aerobic exercises, you know, you're doing aerobics, you're moving around a lot, you have to breathe a lot, so that means you need a lot of oxygen. Maybe that connection will help you remember what aerobic respiration means. Which diagram represents an organelle that contains the enzymes needed to synthesize ATP in the presence of oxygen? Now, there's a lot of words here that are probably familiar to you, but because they're arranged in this sentence, and it's a pretty long sentence or question, you might be confused. So we're talking about an organelle. Before you get too frustrated with the rest of the question, you should go through and try and identify each of these organelles. So let's do that together. Letter A, it's showing you this kind of jelly bean shaped organelle, and you can see these folded membranes inside. This is going to take you back to chapter 7. You have to remember these descriptions. This is a mitochondria. So for letter A, you can write yourself a little note, mitochondria. Letter B, going over. So it's this squiggly, folded membrane looking thing. It's got little black dots all over it. If you remember, okay, those little black dots are ribosomes, and if they're stuck on this thing, this must be the rough endoplasmic reticulum, or rough ER. Letter C looks like a stack of membranes. And the only other thing that kind of looks like a stack of membranes is the Golgi body, or Golgi apparatus. And then letter D, they've cut it in half here, and you can see a dark little circle inside. This is actually the nucleus. The dark little circle is the nucleolus. So now let's go back to the question again. Which diagram represents an organelle that contains the enzymes needed to synthesize ATP? Synthesize means to make. So you might want to write that next to synthesize. So which organelle is going to make ATP in the presence of oxygen? And if you break it down that way and you take your time and figure out what exactly is this question asking, we need to make ATP. What organelle does that? And you should go, oh yeah, that's the mitochondria. That's letter A. Okay, another analogy. This, our bodies have to burn fuel to make energy. So a comparison could be for combustion reactions. This is where you have to burn fuel and you get heat and energy out of it. So if you take a bunch of logs and throw them in a fire, they're going to burn, and they have to have oxygen, because one of the ways to put out a fire is to stifle it of oxygen, take away the oxygen. So you need oxygen for a fire to burn. Think about that fire inside of your organelles. It's not a real fire, but it is generating energy like a fire does. You can see in a fire there's light energy, there's heat energy, and it's going to be releasing carbon dioxide and water as well. Same thing with cellular respiration. The fuel is a little bit different. We're using carbohydrates, let's say glucose. We need oxygen to burn it the best, and we're going to release carbon dioxide, water, and ATP, and some heat. Our body can break down sugar. Sugar is a pretty big molecule compared to the size of the ATP molecule, energy molecules that we can get out of it. So our body can break down the glucose very slowly. So using ATP, ATP is not very stable, so it has to be used pretty much right away, and it can only be used in the cell that's going to be producing it. It's a short-term sort of energy storage, and so when we eat food, the carbohydrates that we take in are broken down, but we can also use them to store as fat for long-term energy storage, and that way we have reserves that our body can go to when we're in need of more energy. A little factoid above these pictures, a working muscle, so one that you're using all the time, recycles over 10 million ATPs per second. That's a lot of ATPs, because remember, when ATP gets used, it turns into ADP, and then you have these extra phosphate molecules they have to get put back on, and then it can be used again. Your muscle cells will have a lot of mitochondria in them versus like your fat cells, which don't do a whole lot as far as activity wise. So when you're looking at different cells in the body, you're going to see that your muscle cells have a lot more mitochondria in them than fat cells do. Okay, so our energy budget. What do we need all this energy for again? We eat food to get ATP out of it. We need it for synthesis, or we can store it. So ATP, just sitting here listening to this video lecture takes energy. Being awake takes energy. Even sleeping requires energy. So that's what it means by resting energy. And then any activity requires ATP. Temperature control, being able to maintain your body at 98.6 degrees takes a lot of energy. So that's another thing that ATP is used for. And then there's synthesis. Synthesis, again, means to make things. So if you don't remember that, you need to write it next to synthesis, means to make. Growing. Right now, all of you are in a growth process in your adolescence. Reproduction. That will require synthesizing sex cells, sperm and egg. That requires energy. And then storage. Stored energy in the form of glycogen, that's stored sugar in your liver, and fat, that's a form of stored energy also. Okay, here's a question. Muscle cells in athletes often have more mitochondria than muscle cells in non-athletes. Based on this observation, it can be inferred that the muscle cells in athletes, and then we have to think about what is different about muscle cells in athletes. Inferred means kind of assume, but with experience. Okay, so we're comparing an athlete to a non-athlete, and we're looking at their muscle cells. The athletes will have more mitochondria. Think about, what is this mitochondria for again? Well, they need energy, right? Muscle cells in athletes are going to be making more energy than non-athletes. So number one, we're looking at, it can be inferred that the muscle cells in athletes have a smaller demand for cell proteins than the muscle cells of non-athletes. Well, it doesn't really make sense to be talking about proteins here, and especially it's not a smaller demand in athletes. So number one really doesn't sound correct. Number two, let's see, it can be inferred that the muscle cells in athletes reproduce less frequently than the muscle cells of non-athletes. Mitochondria and athletes doesn't really have anything to do with reproduction of the cells, so number two is not really a correct answer. Number three, it can be inferred that the muscle cells in athletes have nuclei containing more DNA than nuclei in the muscle cells of non-athletes. Well, the amount of DNA that people have is pretty much the same. We each have the same number of chromosomes, so number three is really wrong. And number four, let's see, it can be inferred that the muscle cells in athletes have a greater demand for energy than the muscle cells of non-athletes. That finally is talking about energy, and it is a true statement. The muscle cells in athletes need more energy than the muscle cells of non-athletes. So number four is your best answer. Okay, what happens if oxygen is missing? What if there's no oxygen available? How does that organism get energy? Well, there's a couple different types of anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration means cellular respiration without oxygen. So you're going to highlight that, and then you're going to add that, without oxygen. Alcohol fermentation is the first kind of anaerobic respiration. Organisms like yeast can do this. What they do is they take glucose without oxygen present, and they can break it down and make ATP, carbon dioxide, and one of the other waste products will be alcohol. Obviously, we know fermentation, this type of fermentation can make beer, wine, it actually makes bread. When you mix yeast in bread, they create a lot of those carbon dioxide bubbles, and that's what makes bread rise. So that's a benefit to knowing about alcohol fermentation and how yeast function, and people have made a lot of money because they understand this process very well. Then there's something called lactic acid fermentation, and this can occur in us, and it occurs in bacteria, and it can occur in you if you're active for a long period of time and your cells use up the oxygen faster than it can be brought in. So then your body switches to lactic acid fermentation, where it can break down glucose, it makes ATP, and then another waste product is going to be lactic acid. Carbon dioxide is produced as well. But the problem with lactic acid is it's very irritating to your cells. And so what happens is your muscles start to ache and feel a burning sensation. It has a purpose. It's meant to make you stop that activity until you can bring in more oxygen, and otherwise you can essentially run out of energy. And that's the lactic acid that causes that sensation. Bacteria can help, they're used to make yogurt, so there's the active cultures in the yogurt using this process. Unfortunately, anaerobic respiration can only make a little bit of ATP. It cannot make as much as regular aerobic respiration can when there's oxygen present. But this is, another avenue in case you don't have oxygen available. Your cells can resort to this and still get energy. Okay, I think we're going to talk about like a compare contrast situation with photosynthesis and cellular respiration. This idea here in the bullet, the reactants in photosynthesis are the same as the products of cellular respiration. So the things that photosynthesis is going to make is what is needed for cellular respiration. And they kind of both work together hand in hand, because then things that are produced in cellular respiration, like carbon dioxide and water, are going to be needed for photosynthesis. It's important for you to understand that photosynthesis, as we know, really only occurs in plants. There's some bacteria that can do it because they need the chloroplasts to do this, okay? Cellular respiration occurs in everything. Plants, animals, bacteria, funguses, everything needs cellular respiration. So everything will have mitochondria. Actually, bacteria don't really have mitochondria. They have a slightly different process where they can get energy. But we're talking the majority of organisms on our planet have mitochondria in their cells, and they can use cellular respiration to get energy. So we're going to look at this a little bit more. Okay, let's do a question. The graphs below show the changes in the relative concentrations of two gases in the air surrounding a group of mice. Which process in the mice most likely accounts for the changes shown? So let's look at the graphs before we look at our choices. We're looking at concentration and time for both of these. And one of them is measuring oxygen and one of them is measuring carbon dioxide. So the first one, as time progresses, oxygen decreases. And then the other one is showing as time progresses, carbon dioxide increases. So now you have to think about what process is going to be using oxygen and producing carbon dioxide. Let's look at our choices. Number 1, active transport. Number 2, evaporation. Number 3, respiration. Number 4, photosynthesis. Well, for me, I would immediately narrow it down to 3 and 4, respiration and photosynthesis. Now go back and look at the graphs again. Which one is using oxygen and which of these processes will be making carbon dioxide? And if you think about it carefully, you can even write down the formula for respiration and photosynthesis if that helps you. But your answer should be 3. In nature, during a 24-hour period, green plants continuously use, so are they always going to be using carbon dioxide only? Number 2, both carbon dioxide and oxygen. Number 3, oxygen only. Or number 4, neither carbon dioxide nor oxygen. So during 24 hours, plants are going to continuously use what? You basically have a choice. Is it oxygen, carbon dioxide, both, or neither? Now, think about it when it's dark out. Are plants going to be able to complete photosynthesis? Which means the question I'm asking, are they going to be using carbon dioxide then? Probably not. So the answer you're going to want to pick is number 3. They can continuously use oxygen all day long because their mitochondria are going to be constantly producing ATP. All of the plant cells are going to require energy throughout the day for photosynthesis, for growing, for reproduction. So you're going to constantly need energy. That means oxygen is going to be needed all day long. All right, now we're going to be comparing photosynthesis and respiration with the following table. Okay, so what we're going to do with this table, I would like you to actually pause the video And I want you to try and fill out this table to the best of your ability, and then you can continue playing the video and see how you did. So I want you to pause right now. Okay, so let's assume that you have gone and filled in this table on your own. Let's go through this together. Photosynthesis. What is the function of photosynthesis? Well, the function for plants, the purpose of photosynthesis is to make food. The location, where does photosynthesis occur? It occurs in those green things, those chloroplasts. And then the reactants. What do plants need? They need carbon dioxide and water. And you could add sunlight. What is a plant going to be making? It's going to make glucose and oxygen. And then our equation for this. Our equation will be let's see if I can, CO2 plus H2O. I can't get an arrow in here very easily, so I'm going to say equals, but I want you know what, actually, let's do it this way. Makes, oh wait, forgot light, is going to make C6H12O6 plus O2. So the function is to make food in the chloroplasts. It's going to require carbon dioxide, water, and light. Plants are going to make glucose and oxygen. And then here is our equation. Now keep in mind in the equation, this 2 right here is going to be a subscript letter 2 or number 2. So is this one. So all the numbers in this formula are going to be small. All right, let's move on to cellular respiration. What is the function of cellular respiration? The purpose of this is to make energy. Where does this occur? Mitochondria. What do we need? Well, if you remember, we need the products of photosynthesis. So we are going to need glucose and oxygen. What are the products? Those will be carbon dioxide and water and ATP. And then our formula is going to be C6H12O6 plus O2. And we're going to do our little arrow produces CO2 plus H2O plus ATP. And hopefully, if you can remember the details on this slide, you may want to put a big star highlight around the edges. If you can remember all of these details, any question that comes up in the future on cellular respiration or photosynthesis, you should be able to answer.